just the title and the picture and my name, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Steve, no problem.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Sorry for the delay. I know how these things go from other applications, but I did not know from your application. So my apologies. We weren't able to work this out ahead of time. So we're going to dig right in. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So to squeeze the history of photography into 90 minutes is a great challenge. So I thought presenting some memorable highlights might encourage some of you to delve in deeper to the rich trove of images and information that we may access in library or online. Please forgive the quality of some of the images, as they are scans of film copies from halftone reproductions in older books. We're going to dig right in, and it'll move along pretty rapidly. So my suggestion is to jot down a quick note as we go along. And at the end, I can stay for questions if you like. So we're all okay? All right.
Yes, I kind of muted everybody so it didn't the background.
As long as you can hear me, I'm fine. Just let me know if you can't hear me anymore, because I can't see the screen controls. So we'll begin with the early records of camera vision. In the 5th century, Moti of China wrote of a pinhole in a darkened room. By the 4th century BC, Aristotle observed an eclipse on the ground through tree leaves. The 10th century, Ibn al-Haytham discovered that aperture size affects definition. By the 13th to 16th century AD, the Renaissance, camera obscuras were widely used. And here's an example of a large portable camera obscura. I'm talking about the camera vision tools. Long before the invention of photography, these tools were being used. The camera obscura, the Bertie's window that you see depicted here, and one could put an eyeball there, have etched glass in this frame, see the image enough to trace onto thin paper. And this dates from 1435, this invention. Another camera vision tool was the silhouette machine. And here's a depiction in 1780. And obviously, it lent for accurate profiles and head studies. And this technology, I remember as a kid, they're still doing some of this, but it lasted a long time. And here's a silhouette from 1786. And another development of the process, the physionotrace in 1792, where you use a silhouette machine for the edge and then work your rendering in between to do a portrait of somebody. Another camera vision tool critical in the invention of photography was the camera lucida. And the camera lucida allowed the artist to put one eyeball on this prism that would see the subject matter, and the other eyeball was kept open on the drawing board, and you put a piece of paper there, and the brain combined the image. So one could trace very quickly with this and work in the field, a rather small little device. Here's a camera lucida drawing of the Temple of Juno in Sicily, 1824. And this is done by Sir John Herschel. And Herschel invented fixer and was an early innovator and one of those artists that was frustrated by the fact that they could get images to trace, but they couldn't make a permanent fixture to a paper or piece of metal or any material. So you had all the ingredients for the invention of photography there by the 1820s. And here's a camera obscura, typical one from around that time, a lens and with an aperture in it, a mirror to bounce the image. You have a single lens reflex. It could be focused here by moving the front of the box back and forth, and then one could trace the image there. So you can see how these early inventors wanted to figure out how to make that permanent. So by 1906, Joseph Nicephore Niepce produced this earliest surviving photograph, a view of a courtyard, a heliograph. And this took all day long to produce. It's interesting because the shadows are on both sides for the long exposure that would occur to make this. Now, Niepce and Louis Daguerre went into partnership in France to work on the process. But back in England, William Henry Fox Talbot was inventing his process, which he called photogenic drawing. Here's one as early as 1835, the earliest surviving photogenic drawing, and it was a salted paper print made with what was called a mousetrap camera, a very small camera obscura. And this is the, as you can see, it's a negative of the shooting out of the window at Laycock Abbey. Now, it is his process, Talbot's process, that we inherited for the 20th through the 20th century, the negative to positive process. Now, here's an example of a later version of this process. First, it was called photogenic drawing, and then it was called Talbot type after his name, and finally it was called a calotype. And the calotype, when you see that used, it means that it's a latter version of this process whereby they used improved paper with less fiber showing, and usually it was a waxed paper. So it gave the clearest rendition short of glass. This is from 1857 of the Roman Forum by an unknown photographer. Now, back in France, Daguerre and Niepce had gone into partnership, but it was Louis Daguerre who ended up announcing the invention of photography in 1839. Here is an 1837 earliest surviving daguerreotype, and when he made this announcement, a couple of interesting things occurred. He had put together a package that one could purchase. I believe it was around $300, which would be big money in those days. People of means usually, and leisure time, would purchase these early packages, or people that wanted to start. Here's a photograph of a Parisian boulevard that was presented to the King of Bavaria in 1839. And as you can see, the only person or vehicle still on this busy Parisian boulevard is the one getting a shoe shine here. It's very long exposure. The typical package, as I mentioned, would come with a camera and the holders and the all the accoutrements of physical equipment, along with the chemistry to start doing daguerreotypes. Here's an example of an early daguerreotype studio done in 1843. And the daguerreotype was presented in a handsome case that usually had some sort of textured exterior, felt, even embossed felt in the inside. The daguerreotype was a very delicate material, so it had to be protected by glass, and then you put an overmat over it for decoration, and to not show the rough edges where the damage by handling could occur in the process, and then an outer piece of glass over it. It made a very handsome little package whereby people could sell portraits to their clientele. Back to the British Isles, William Henry Fox Talbot, with his photogenic drawing, was doing photograms. And here's an image that one could see if you contact printed that to another sheet of salted paper, you could produce a positive. But all the fibers would show up in that final result. I'll talk about the difference between the appearance of daguerreotypes and the calotypes and talbotypes in a moment. Here's a Talbot photograph of sailing craft done in 1845. This is with a calotype negative, so you've got a pretty fine rendition. But as you can see, in order to get ships still, you had to wait till low tide. Now, coincidentally, another inventor of photography was at work in France, Hippolyte Bayard. And this is his still life from 1839. And his process was a direct positive on paper. It was a one-of-a-kind, like a daguerreotype, but it was positive right from the get-go. Now, as and economic politics would work, the Daguerre managed to convince Bayard to hold back his announcement of his invention, thereby sort of stealing the limelight and getting a heads up on the patenting situation and the ability to market one's photograph. Now, Hippolyte Bayard did the earliest exhibition of photographs that was recorded 1839. And this next year, you can see from his self-portrait as a drowned man, the title of this picture, we might say that it's the earliest surviving selfie. It's done in 1840. And clearly, Jonathan and I were talking about this, about, when was photography considered an art form. And well, as early as 1839, these folks were taking it very seriously. They were frustrated drawers and painters. And as you can see from this William Henry Fox Talbot photograph, which, if you can imagine the elements of it, the subject matter being more modern, it could be something that we might photograph today. Well, very well balanced, strong aesthetics being worked. This is called The Open Door, 1843. And it's plate number 6 of The Pencil of Nature, which was produced from 1844 through 46. And it was the first book of photographs that contained photographs. Also in the British Isles, you had Hill and Adamson at work, creating wonderful portraits through their studio. This is one example of their work. And here's a portrait of his partner, David Octavius Hill, done in 1846 by Robert Adamson. And all the elements of interesting portraiture were at work. These folks were trained in art and in science. Really quite amazing folks. This is an unknown American photographer, a daguerreotype done in 1850, and when the first forms of photography made it to the United States, which is rather quickly, the daguerreotype took off rather than the talbotype or calotype, though people did use those here. Daguerreotype was the dominant process used, and the American ingenuity to the creation of very fine plates, which could produce wonderful results. Now, these are not terribly good examples, but they're historically very critical, because this is from August 1843, the oldest surviving original photograph of an American president, John Quincy Adams. And the daguerreotype often would be hand colored. So they would apply some pigment to the surface before framing it in the beautiful little frame arrangement that I showed you. This is a Sauk chief Keokuk portrait made in 1843 by Thomas Easterly, a daguerreotype. Here's a wonderful daguerreotype of Frederick Douglass, the early abolitionist, and it's he was very astute and understood that this was the coming art form, and so he had many pictures, posed for many pictures in his time. Here's an unknown American photographer's family group, 1850, daguerreotype again. And by the 1850s, the process was very improved. So instead of long hours to make exposures, now we're down to minutes or even possibly a little shorter, but usually in the minutes. So a daguerreotype like this could have been made that showed some action occurring, actually people that didn't disappear into movement obscurity. 1853. As one would guess, expeditionary photographers got to work to bring home views of exotic places. So this is the work of Maxime Ducamp, the Colossus of Abu Simbel in Egypt in 1850. It's a calotype. Here's another view by him. And in a time when most people didn't travel more than 25 or 100 miles from their home, these were very extraordinary. And a boon to this expeditionary work was the invention of albumin paper and the collodion wet plate process, both around 1850. And the process in the collodion wet plate process to make the negative consisted of cellulose nitrate or gun cotton soaked in nitric and sulfuric acid and then dried. This was then dissolved in a mixture of alcohol and ether with potassium iodide. And it was coated, as you'll see in a moment, and had to remain not totally dry, tacky, and it then had to be quickly exposed in the camera and then brought back and processed in one's darkroom. So here we have some etchings of the process. The first step being to polish the plate so you have a very fine piece of glass. The next, coating the plate and sensitizing it. The chemistry was wonderful because I saw a video just recently of Emily Redondo's guest doing collodion wet plate for the Fresno City College class. And here you poured this onto the plate, you rotated it around so you get a nice even covering. Then you sensitized it with the chemistry that would be light sensitive. Then it was allowed to get tacky and then, but not totally dry, exposed in the camera, and then processed, developed, and then washed. And of course, I'm oversimplifying the process, but you can see that it was pretty elaborate and pretty amazing that they could do this in the field. Now, quickly, the collodion wet plate process made obsolete the daguerreotype and the calotype, etc. The process that came before were hardly used until they got rediscovered in more recent times, but most of the time it sort of faded into the background. Now, this is by Francis Frith, The Pyramids of Dashur, Egypt, and done in 1858. And this is an albumin print from a collodion wet plate negative. So once the collodion wet plate was dry, you could make print after print, and it was very impervious to damage. Although photographers did, when they ran out of glass, they would scratch off the emulsion and go through the process again. And read. Now, the albumin paper was a wonderful invention because it was a thin paper, as the name implies, using egg whites for part of the emulsion support, and it could produce a beautiful long tonal range from the collodion wet plate. And you could get this material already packaged very quickly after its invention. They managed to get paper accessible. Now, also in 1849, the stereograph began to be used. The first form was with daguerreotypes, and as many of you have seen, little stereopticons, etc. By the time the wet plate process came into being in albumin prints, you could build smaller cameras with twin lenses and be able to do a stereo image. And the advantage of that was many-fold, because the cameras were smaller, they were quite portable. Since the shutters were smaller, you could get higher shutter speeds. And so for the first time, motion was really stopped in folks walking mid-stride or vehicles moving on the road. So this was revolutionary, and stereographs were all over the place. Stereo photographs were all over, and you can still find many of them when you go to antique stores, so that they were that plentiful. Here's a stereo photograph of the original Monitor after her fight with the Merrimac, done in 1862. So they were photographing scenes, people, especially where three-dimensionality would be interesting because it was a 3D image when viewed through the viewer. Now, also, at work, the most popular motif was portraiture, and those went on from the beginnings of photography, and studios were very popular, as you can imagine. To be able to buy, to sit for a portrait under a very short time frame, and then be able to purchase that, clear a likeness of oneself or of one's family, was a powerful tool for family memories and for professional use. Now, this is by Lewis Carroll. This is a portrait of Alice Liddell, the original Alice in Wonderland, 1859, and it's an albumin print. Here's a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, albumin print, 1860, and multiple prints could be made and marketed as well. And so the photographers such as Nadar here would photograph Sarah Bernhardt, the actress, 1865. This is an albumin print, and again, the aesthetics were strong at work. The use of light and gesture and expression were really well entrenched. So the next innovation was to take the camera and the technology up in the air. Most photographs were made at eye level, shooting straight ahead to keep everything sharp and monitor things very carefully that way. But in 1858, the first successful photograph from a balloon was made, and this is by Nadar of the Grand Boulevards of Paris in 1868. Now, you'll see multiple images here because a single plate, a single collodion plate was used with either multiple lenses or a movable back, and it allowed a wonderful economy. During a studio visit, you could get 8 different views, different poses, expressions, etc. Here's the potential for the next popular development in photography, the carte de visite. And the carte de visite was one of these sections of photographs. You cut this one down and then mount this albumin print ending up on a little card that used to be used for polite society to introduce oneself. And so that size remained constant. So the first photo albums that were created during this time, or these early photo albums, would be had the same size windows in the pages, and therefore you could collect portraits of family, friends, as well as famous people. Okay. Let me move on here to this one. Here's a carte de visite of Queen Victoria, 1861, and here's an example of a famous person whose image was collected and put in various folks' albums. And if you see the whole figure, that means the carte de visite dates earlier. Later, you would see more close-up portrait, head and shoulder shots, etc., and those are later carte de visites. Now, women and had many restrictions in employment, as you can imagine, in the 1840s and 50s, but they dug right in and created very wonderful images. Here's an Anna Atkins series of cyanotypes, which was an adapted blueprint process, and people are still doing cyanotypes today. The earliest being 1849. And if you ever travel up to Stanford Museum, you can see a lot of Anna Atkins' work there in person. Now let's go back to the collodion wet plate process for documentary work. Here is Mr. Fenton's photographic van, and Roger Fenton was a groundbreaker in photographing the battlefield and the aspects behind the scenes of warfare. And unfortunately, this is from the Crimean expedition in 1855. So he covered the Crimean War. This is by Fenton, and an albumin print, 1855. And this is probably his most famous image, The Valley of the Shadow of Death, 1855. And now he's photographing the battlefield once cleared of bodies, and then the collodion wet plate was highly ultraviolet sensitive, so you see no sky. This was a problem for photographers. So if they wanted the foreground, they would have to make one exposure. And if they wanted the sky, they'd have to make another exposure. They couldn't get them on the same plate. So early on, they discovered it would be good to do combination. And combination printing is using one negative to print in one area, masking the other part of the print, and then printing that from another separate negative. And the same thing with the here. This was burned in to give the hint of a sky up here. So this is by Camille Sylvie in 1858, an albumin print result. Now let's take this to the extreme. This is Oscar Gustav Rehlander's The Two Ways of Life, 1857, an albumin print. He made 30 negatives in all, which he masked so they would fit together like a picture puzzle. Then painstakingly masking a sheet of sensitized paper to match each negative in turn. He printed them one after the other in the appropriate positions. And this was considered high art when these folks were doing this combination printing, at least in photographic circles. And the other major mover and shaker in this was Henry Peach Robinson. And here you see his preliminary sketch for one of his pieces and a resulting similar combination print called Fading Away, 1858. And as you can see, this guy would have been one negative, and the curtains in that area another negative, and the subject on that side is a different negative than the subject on this side, all painstakingly masked and contact printed. Here's a montage by O.G. Rehlander called Hard Times, albumin print, 1860, excuse me. And written on the mount, it said, a spiritistical photo. Now, two other developments from the collodion wet plate process were the ambrotype and the tintype. Now, the ambrotype was a collodion wet plate negative that was placed against a black background to allow it to appear as a positive. Now, the ambrotype fulfilled a niche in the daguerreotype market, and was very popular. You can find them today, and the way to determine them compared to a daguerreotype is a mirror-like surface. You tilt it slightly, and you can see kind of a negative result. On the ambrotype, it looks totally positive. So when you tilt it, it does not change to a negative image. You're just seeing the negative because the back was peeled off of this to show as an example. But when you look at it from the side, you can see a little three-dimensionality because it's on glass in front of the dark background. The other major innovation that became hugely popular was the tintype or ferrotype. And this is also collodion wet plate emulsion coated on what was called a japanned black iron. And so it was this really rich iron background or black background that once the emulsion was coated over it, immediately looked like a positive. This is from the Civil War, 1862. Now, Matthew Brady and his associates formed a group and worked through the Civil War, extremely documented conflict. As if you've seen the Rick Burns documentary, one of the more famous images from this is Timothy O'Sullivan's A Harvest of Death, 1863, an albumin print. And here now we're seeing the aftermath of the battle with humans evident. And this is the notorious home of the rebel sharpshooter, Gettysburg, an albumin print by Alexander Gardner, 1863. And scholars now believe that the photographer or his assistant moved the body into this position and the elements to make it a more dramatic photograph, because apparently that body appears in one of his other photographs. Not exactly ethical journalism. Now, I mentioned powerful photographers with their studios, one of which was Julia Margaret Cameron. This is the portrait of the mother of Virginia Woolf from 1867, albumen print. And she's really well known for her approach to portraiture, and very carefully crafted, and a lot of emotive quality. This is called A Kiss of Peace, 1867. And here's a portrait of the inventor Sir John Herschel, who did that camera lucida drawing of the Temple of Juno you saw earlier. This is from 1867, and I find this to be a very poignant portrait of the man, albumen print. Now, another development in the medium was the Woodbury type, or photoglypty. And this was a photomechanical process, and without going into all of the details, kind of similar to photogravure later on, but it had a wonderful range of tones. Of course, you're seeing poor copies of these, but you can tell that they're tonally, they have a great range. Here's a portrait of Charles Baudelaire done in 1863, a Woodbury type. Portrait of Abraham Lincoln, 1865, albumen print by Alexander Gardner. Now, I mentioned that folks were continuously working on an expeditionary photography, taking the camera with on travels of discovery and adventure. Here is a picture by John K. Hillers of John Wesley Powell and Tao Gu, the great chief of the Paiutes, done in 1872. And Powell and Tao Gu were navigating for the first time the Grand Canyon of the Colorado. William Henry Jackson, who did early photographs of what would later become national parks. This is Old Faithful Geyser in Yellowstone National Park, 1872, an albumen print. One of the Brady Bunch, they're not called the Brady Bunch, but the team of photographers that worked together in the Civil War was Timothy O'Sullivan and also Alexander Gardner. But Timothy O'Sullivan went on to do expeditionary photography. This is a portrait of him with his mammoth plate camera. This is a half of a stereograph exposure, and this is 1870. But Timothy O'Sullivan went along with the exploration and surveys of the west of the 100th meridian as the United States moved west in their explorations. He went along and photographed these remarkable places. This is Canyon de Chelly. Many of you know this as to be White House ruin. It looks suspiciously familiar to the Ansel Adams version of it. We all interpret these things in interesting ways, some of them very similar to our historical precedents. Now, here's a picture by William Henry Jackson of the photographer's assistants done in 1891. The mule team, glass plates, mammoth plate glass plates. So imagine having not only to be careful with your camera, but your film from breakage. And clambering over terrain with no roads and barely pathways, and really groundbreaking nature photography. So to make larger prints, one had to use a larger camera and produce a larger negative, collodion wet plate negative. In order to make an enlargement, something like this would have to be used, and very few people had access. This is the solar camera Jupiter from 1866. And as you can see, it's arranged like a telescope. They follow the sun so that the sun would give consistent illumination through the negative, and therefore different size prints could be made. But for the most part, folks stuck with contact printing as their maximum size. Now, technology improved. Every year or two, something important would be discovered, or at least every 5 years or so. By this time, in 1878, the small high-speed cameras were used with tripwires by Edward Muybridge, who documented the galloping horse sequence that is so famous, and proved Leland Stanford in a bet, proved for the winner that the sorry for my stammering here, all four of the hooves would be above the ground, not one touching the ground. And this really wasn't exactly proven until this sequence was done. Now, the side benefit to this whole procedure was that one could have the prints in a circular attached sequence and placed in a zoetrope or zoopraxiscope, so that, which was a cylinder through which there was a slot you could look, and by spinning it, you would see them combine in motion, much like a picture book that became the predecessor of motion picture technology and innovation. People were not just in balloons, but they were climbing to heights, photographing downward by the turn of the century, and close up with objects, etc. So the motifs started to change a bit in the latter 2 decades of the 19th century. This is by Émile Zola, the Eiffel Tower in New York, in Paris. Now, some critical things were happening with the evolution of the materials. You had a new development called the dry plate. Now, prior to this, people were using the wet plate photography, and the dry plate used gelatin as the medium in which the emulsion, the silver particles would be emerged, apart, and the light-sensitive particles. And the dry plate was a tremendous innovation for photographers, because it could be mass-produced and presented in a bulk to a photographer, and they could apply their collodion wet plate contact to this dry plate that was even more versatile than the albumin paper. And I'm oversimplifying here, skipping over a lot of things, so my apologies for that. The other development was that when the emerged, and of course that's on glass, and it's a much finer quality negative that you could get because it didn't have any imperfections in it, etc. Once it was mass produced. But the other innovation to come would be the flexible nitrocellulose base, which we'll talk about in a moment, which what we call film. Now, at around that time, in the 1886, there were folks jumping on board with the dry plate and gelatin silver emulsions that would be invented, but there were also photographers who were using platinum or palladium as emulsions to make very permanent images hand-coded onto paper. Now, we'll come back to that in a moment. This is by P.H. Emerson. This is called Gathering of the Water Lilies, and Emerson espoused the wonder of photography, straight photography, being a fine art in and of itself. And he wrote extensively about this, and we'll talk about that a bit more. Here's an advertisement in 1889 for the Kodak #1 camera. So you had the dry plates that had risen to the surface as a very popular medium, and then I mentioned that the flexible nitrocellulose base was produced, which allowed a roll of film to be produced. And George Eastman had the clever idea of pre-packaging 100 exposures in a camera that was very simple to use, hand holdable, small little shutter, very simple shutter, and one could expose 100 pictures, and instead of being a chemist or wealthy to afford all of the accoutrements of a darkroom, you could turn it into his company. They would process these into prints. You get 100 prints back and a camera reloaded with another 100 exposure roll. And as you may remember, and as you can see, this became a boon for more common use of the camera. And by folks being more had candid pictures like this being made in 1888. Here's a portrait of George Eastman by Fred Church with his #2 Kodak camera, 1890. Another development that was important, latter part of the 19th century, and took hold until electricity and the flash unit came into being later, the use of flash powder. And here's a Jacob Riis photograph, Italian mother and her baby in Jersey Street, New York, 1888. And here you can see from the shadow, this is an early type of flash photography with the powder that explodes, and you get a very short burst of light and can stop a great deal of action with one of those. You don't have to worry about eye movement or body, neck, head movement, etc. In a photograph. Here is a 5 Cents Lodging, Bayard Street, New York, 1889. A layout from the first book to contain halftones. And this is his How the Other Half Lives. Jacob Riis was I would call him a crusading social documentary photographer. And he wasn't shy about this. He was very critically interested in the social conditions of the time, immigrants as they moved into New York. Here's Bandit's Roost, 59.5 Mulberry Street, 1888. And you'll see more of his work in a little while. Now, the last part of the 19th century, the last decade, was an important one for change. The last 2 decades is very similar to the last 2 decades of the 20th century. There was this huge explosion of innovation in all kinds of areas of our lives. And your own group, the Fresno Camera Club, I believe Jonathan or somebody else told me that this chapter dates back to the late 19th century, one of the oldest in the United States. Well, this tradition started with what's called pictorialism, and pictorialism existed right around the same time that photo clubs really propped up in major cities all over the West, for sure. And early users of the pictorialist methods would evolved, many of them evolved into other things. But here's an example from Frederick Evans, a portrait of Aubrey Beardsley done in 1895, and it's a platinum print. Now the pictorialists, like similar to P.H. Emerson before, were liked the use of non-gelatin silver printing. So even though that started to become the dominant medium, hand coating platinum paper and using gun bichromate process, these were popular amongst the pictorialists because it lent a painterly effect, and that was very important for the pictorialists. They were the Impressionists and the other painter artists and the society, art society that and gallery scene and salon scene of the mid 19th century were aghast with the invention of photography for a couple of reasons. One was that now they were sort of taking the limelight from realist paintings that came before, and you see a lot of movements in art revolutionized because painters moved into areas that weren't so attached to realism because photography did it so well. But there was also a reverse movement. Photographers like Frederick Evans could do really clear, sharp, direct approach kinds of straight photography, as you see here with his Sea of Steps Wells Cathedral, but also was working with pictorialist sensibilities with the soft focus. This is a platinum print. It's soft focus on purpose, very romantic in feel. This was very popular amongst the pictorialists, as you'll see. Now, Stieglitz began as a pictorialist, and Alfred Stieglitz, significant to photography in many ways, but he bridged both the pictorialist world and the sort of fine art straight photographic approach that became immensely popular later. This is his Waiting for the Return, 1895. And it's a gravure print. And I mentioned when that the Woodbury type was a photomechanical process. The gravure print was also a photomechanical process, and was very popular amongst the pictorialists. They were experimenting so much. Here's a lantern slide called The Terminal, done in 1893 by Alfred Stieglitz. So this is a rear lit transparency. Here is one of his more direct approach, straight photographs. And Stieglitz shifted his philosophy as an early pictorialist with his last edition of Camera Work magazine, a very influential early journal in photography. He published and featured a lot of the pictorialists of the time, himself included. And but the last issue was devoted to Paul Strand, and really championed the straight approach as being the photography of the fine art photography genre that he wanted to see move forward. Now, here's another example of pictorialism. Often you would stage models, create tableaus, and this is by F. Holland Day. Not ashamed to do soft focus and very much the style of an older painting. Clarence White, a hugely popular pictorialist, Ring Toss, 1899, a platinum print. And Gertrude Casebier, or Casebier, I've heard it pronounced two ways, Blessed Art Thou Among Women, 1900, a platinum print. Again, pictorialist sensibilities, romantic, soft, and formal in approach. Painters were using photography still, and they openly used photographic studies. So this Thomas Eakins painting called The Swimming Hole used a series of photographs that he made with his students as model. Imagine taking your class out to do this today. Thomas Eakins was quite an innovator. He did this image called The History of a Jump, 1884-85. And this kind of novel approach to photography, revealing things that the eye can't see or prove, really had an impact on painting and the art world. And up above, you see Edgar Degas, Frieze of Dancers, 1893. And Degas was an avid photographer, used them for studies. And as you can see in this image, that it's very much a casualness of view and a chopped off image that you wouldn't see normally in paintings prior to the invention of photography. Very influenced. The same with Marcel Duchamp. This is a little bit later, 1912, Nude Descending a Staircase. You probably wouldn't get that if you didn't know this kind of thing would exist. And again, we're going to flip back and forth. The pictorialists were trying to emulate painters, and the painters were being influenced by photography. Here, the pictorialists René Lebesgue and Frank Eugene are hand coating their paper so that the strokes show on the edges, looking much like it's a charcoal drawing on a piece of paper. John Dudley Johnston, Liverpool. It's entitled An Impression, 1906. Very much going with the granular kind of pointillist post-impressionist painting movement. Gum bichromate print. And to show you how direct it can be, this is Richard Pollock's The Artist and His Model, 1914, a platinum print. Here's Vermeer, 1665 to 70, The Art of Painting. So one can see how direct the correlation can be. 1898, August Sander did a series of wonderful portraits of his country folk of Germany, and went on to influence a lot of later portrait photographers. The turn of the century brought money, and photographers were deep in it, trying to record some of these changes as things move so fast. And here, Adam Clark Roman made this wonderful portrait in the Zuni Pueblo interior, 1897. Jacques-Henri Lartigue was given a camera for the first time at age 5, and he started using it to photograph the social life of Paris from his point of view, being one of that class, and his casualness of view became a trademark. And here's another really important one by Lartigue, the Grand Prix of the Automobile Club of France. It's he had the courage to pan with his focal plane camera in the opposite direction of the movement, therefore altering the physical shape of things in motion. 1912. Eugene Ache was understood that the boulevards of Paris were being widened, neighborhoods were being changed, so he did an extensive study in the streets of Paris. This is Taylor Dummies, Paris, an Aristotype print, 1910, 1920. Prostitute, Paris, 1920s, gold-toned printing out paper. And many of you, if you are anywhere near my age, may remember that portraits were made with what was called studio proof. And studio proof was a printing out paper that you get from the studio to choose which pose you want, and it would fade because it wasn't fixed. So the studio could then sell you the final finished prints, properly processed to survive. But artists found that printing out paper gave a hugely wonderful range of tones, and it could be toned, in this case with gold toner, to produce a very rich result. The Wright brothers at work, and here you can see a photographer with a pretty portable arrangement now, and probably who knows, it's probably a stereo camera too. This is half of a stereograph. The Wright brother airplane in flight, 1903. Now, going back to the crusading photographers documenting social change, Louis Hine did a series of child labor portraits. This is Carolina Cotton Mill, 1908, a gelatin silver print. And this is his famous Breaker Boys in a Coal Mine, 1911. And he was not trying to pull any punches with regard to his motivation for making these photographs. Here's a poster called Making Human Junk in 1915. And so his crusading work ended up working towards child labor laws. Alfred Stieglitz is doing this more subtly in the Steerage, 1907. Here we're seeing two different classes on a boat crossing in New York Harbor, 1907, photogravure. In New Orleans, E.J. Belloc was at work doing the Storyville portraits, 1913. And this again was a silver print on printing out paper, and which, and even though it's fairly damaged, still you can see the range of tones is really powerful. African Americans had studios as well. Here's Addison Scurlock, Waterfront from 1915, and James Vanderzee, Couple in Raccoon Coats in New York. back to Stieglitz. He had two galleries in New York, and through these galleries, um, he promoted various photographers and modern artists. He brought to the attention of America the artists such as Picasso, and here Georgia O'Keeffe, his wife, and Ansel Adams, etc. If one had a show in Stieglitz's gallery, one had quite arrow in their quiver. Stieglitz was remarkable in a variety of ways, having the galleries, espousing the medium for its value as a fine art, and so for its philosophical meaning. He came up with a term called equivalence. He did a series of cloud photographs, and more than describing the visible surface of things, the works could express pure emotion, paralleling the artist's own inner state or feeling. And this concept became very popular amongst some later photographers. One of his colleagues was Edward Steichen, who did a variety of things. Here's a powerful portrait of J.P. Morgan, one of the wealthiest men on earth, done in 1903. And of course, as you can see, Morgan was not enamored with this portrait of him being published, and the psychological symbolic nature of it as a wealthy industrialist with not only strength but determination and perhaps ruthlessness. The Pears and Apple, 1919 by Steichen, is an example of the movement in the tens and teens of the 20th century to still life and close up and more abstraction in photography. Here's a Paul Strand photograph called The White Fence, 1916, and it's a photogravure. This, as you remember, I mentioned, he was the last issue of Camera Work by Stieglitz was featuring Paul Strand, and he became a huge influence on Ansel Adams, because Ansel Adams looked at the negatives of Strand and didn't even look at the prints and was blown away enough to swing his pendulum from music to photography. Alvin Langdon Coburn, The Octopus. Now he's got an aerial point of view, not really depicting it for its documentary sake, but more for its suggestive aesthetic sake. Paul Strand again, New York, pushing the envelope with regard to composition. It's got the person way over to the side, part of it cut off, a lot of tension created in the image, very modern kind of approach. He did wonderful things with, throughout his career, wonderful portraits. And here's the family, Luzzara, 1953. In the late teens and early 20s, photojournalism, smaller cameras, because of the roll film, could be used than sheet film cameras. And people like Andre Cortez, starting in World War I, and then with smaller cameras, using it in novel ways, did a lot of photojournalistic work, and then this aerial, almost abstraction, wonderful arrangement called Carrefour Blois 1930. He did a wide range of photographs, photographic motifs, rather, from straight documentary to this sort of almost pictorialist version called Satiric Dancer, 1926. And you'll see some distorted mirror pictures here pretty soon. Now we're moving just after World War I. Christian Schad. Now I'm skipping a lot of areas of photography, but we're focusing on how photographic artists approach the medium in different ways as we get closer to today. Christian Schad did this photogram he called his Shadographs, 1918. And what followed World War I was a movement called Dada. And Dada was not a style so much as a world view. And it consisted of citizen provocateurs that organized incendiary public events. And what I mean by that is they would have things called happenings, and they would have performance and art on the walls and audience interaction. This was very novel. And the art world really took off in Paris and in Mexico City, were hubs that drew artists from all countries. And this one is called The Cut of the Kitchen Knife by Hannah Hook in 1919. And and this was using the technique of collage, cut and paste. Collage comes from the root word collier, which means to glue or to paste. Man Ray was one of these photographers who was doing Dada-like work, and then the following movement called Surreal, 1929. Moving from the United States to Paris. And of course, for those of you who know the methodology here, this was loosely called a solarization, but it's really a Sabatier effect. And that's the re-exposing of a negative or a print to light after the images started developing. And it causes a reversal. You see kind of both negative and positive at the same time. True solarization is a bright light source reversing a value, which we can talk about another time. Francis Bruguiere did this light abstraction. Now we've got persons cutting up paper and lighting it and then photographing it, and the final product is the photograph. So it's a temporary sculptural work in light and time, 1929. Man Ray again, Wire, Spiral, and Smoke, it was untitled, but it's called Wire, Spiral, and Smoke, 1923. Gelatin silver print. He did an extensive number of photograms. Andre Cortez on the right here, he did a series of nude studies in a distorting mirror. And just to show you another motif that he used. On the left, Louis Ducos de Oran did some adventures with a distorting camera as early as 1888. But they commonly fall into a category that is referred to as surrealism, and it mirrored the explosion of this kind of art in the art world, both with painting and sculpture. In photography, you had examples like Carl Tige on the left, and Man Ray's The Violin of Ingres, 1924. Now, surrealism used chance and accident, biomorphism, found objects, scale changes, levitation, juxtaposing, dislocation, transparency. All these things were used. And here's a good example by Herbert Bayer, 1932, called Lonely Metropolitan. So collage was commonly used, montage was commonly used. And montage is the overlapping of images, often with double exposure or double exposure in the camera or in the printing process. Now, this whole time between the two wars, World War I and World War II, this explosion of modern art was happening. And modern art was a movement towards simplification and working with the essentials. So this sequence here by Konstantin Brancusi shows the evolution from realism to a form of abstraction with the same subject matter. This is very much a modernist point of view. Here's a very much a modernist example by Margarethe Mather, a photograph called Billy Justima in Man's Summer Kimono, 1923. Coming in close, simplification again, and another movement critical in art and that affected a lot of photographers was constructivism. And constructivism came from Eastern European Russian avant-garde, and it was reducing the image to geometrical fundamentals in abstraction, and oftentimes just physical materials, simple physical materials were used. And here we've got Dritkal sort of combining constructivist ideas and pictorialist approach with this soft focus. Imogen Cunningham, triangles. This very poor example, but a very influential photograph done in 1929. And Imogen was another one of those great masters who did so many things. I can't begin to go into it. If you get to the Getty Museum sometime soon, they have a major retrospective of her work. But she started out early on doing pictorialism, not just pictorialism, but did a lot of pictorialist kind of work in the early days and working with the figure. Also plants. She was a mother, single mother, and little squirts running around, and she worked with what was close to her. This is one of her famous Magnolia Bud series, 1920s, and here we're talking about gelatin silver work. Now Cunningham and some colleagues like Edward Weston, who you see here, Cabbage Leaf, 1931, and Nude, 1936, combined forces with Ansel Adams and a variety of other photographers to form F64, and their first exhibition was in the Bay Area, and they were a group of West Coast photographers who espoused a similar philosophy. And they, going back to P.H. Emerson's first espousing photography as an art form in its own right, without a tremendous amount of manipulation. Very direct approach, straight photography. And that group F64 had a great post influence. Another member, Tina Modati, another worker during that time, Tina Modati, mother and child from Tehuantepec, Oaxaca, Mexico, 1929. In Paris again, Brassai was working in the bijoux and the clubs and photographing nightlife. And all of this was happening in from the 20s right up to World War II. And this is a self-portrait by Herbert Bayer in 1932. And this category, as you could, if you had to categorize it, is very much the surrealist approach. Another example, John Hartfield, Adolf the Superman. He eats gold and spews idiocies, 1932. There's fascinating history behind these that we won't go into since we're already at 80 minutes. We're going to go pretty quickly here. Hans Spellmer, Dolls Games, plate number 7, 1936. Here the artist is using sculpture and then photographing as a final result. Documentary photography went into the combat zone, again with the Spanish Civil War, which was a powerful example of the fascist versus socialist philosophies in Spain, and many photographers went there to photograph. Here's Robert Capa, The Death of a Loyalist Soldier. Here's Henri Cartier-Bresson, Children Playing in Ruins, 1933. Arthur Rothstein, the coming of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. The Farm Security Administration was formed and hired photographers that couldn't find work otherwise to document the changing conditions of the country. And a powerful group of photographs resulted from that, documentary photographs of life during that time. And here's one of the icons, Dorothea Lange, migrant mother, Nipomo, California, 1936. FSA photographer, as well as Walker Evans, who focused a lot on storefronts and some of the physical aspects of changing America during that time. Bernice Abbott in New York in another project called, it was a federal art project similar to the FSA, where during the Depression, these photographers were financed. And their works ended up being owned by either the Library of Congress or whoever they were working for. Bernice Abbott. Ben Shahn, another. And he was sort of the one of the groundbreakers for what would later be called the snapshot genre, where it's not level, heads are cut off, there's movement over to the side, and very seemingly accidental, but very much sensitive to the dynamics of change in the scene in front of him. Bill Brent in England, 1937, Coal Searcher. Margaret Burke White, Hamilton, Alabama, 1937, from You Have Seen Their Faces. And Burke White, as you may know, was the first to have a cover on the first issue of Life magazine. The Explosion of the Hindenburg by Sam Shore, 1937. Powerful documents were being made. Then the advent of the electronic flash added another element of range for photographers. And here you have the wonderful photograph of Martha Graham in Letter to the World by Barbara Morgan, pardon me. I have to take a sip of this here, hold on. 1941. Another person using flash, Ouija, or Arthur Felig, The Critic, New York, 1943. Notorious street photographer, walkie-talkie that would receive police calls, and it would oftentimes be first on the scene of calamities and events and other kinds of events. Arnold Newman, a portrait of the surrealist artist Max Ernst, 1942. Now, Cartier-Bresson, who I mentioned earlier, coined the term the decisive moment. And he was known for his photojournalistic work, where he had uncanny timing for capturing the right moment. Here's his portrait of Henri Matisse in 1944. and using tremendous use of composition and the elements at hand to his advantage. Another Bresson street photograph indicating just the right moment where elements come together throughout the frame. Leading lines, positions of figures, mid-stride, etc. We're coming closer to the end here. Bear with me. W. Gene Smith, a movie just came out about his life. I think it's called Minamata, but I always try to watch the film interpretations of some of these photographers' lives, and they stretch the truth a bit here and there, or a lot, but it is wonderful to see depictions of how these folks worked in the field, because they do a lot of scholarship before they make these modern films on these folks. W. Gene Smith, a primary life photographer, did extensive work in World War II, but after he came back from multiple surgeries after the war, his first image, serious image that came of it after coming out of the hospital, was of his own children taking a walk to Paradise Garden, 1946. He's the one that did the series on Minamata, which dealt with the mercury poisoning from a factory effluent into the fish that the village folks ate, and it affected newborns and is still affecting people to this day. This is from 1972. In New York in 47, post-war, Irving Penn was at work, and here group photography and fashion photography, etc., really taking off full speed after the war. Alfred Eisenstadt, another life photographer, portrait of Bertrand Russell. Portrait of Alfred Stieglitz under the painting by George O'Keeffe of his wives, done by Ansel Adams. And here, if you haven't had a chance to go down to the Fresno Art Museum, there is an Ansel Adams exhibit in the Meridian Gallery. Really wonderful selection from their permanent collection. I highly recommend it. White Branch, Mono Lake. Very influential on younger photographers, even today. Minor White espoused the philosophy of Alfred Stieglitz, equivalence, and did a variety of powerful works with that concept in mind. And I am very oversimplifying his impact. This is the age of instructors, from Ansel Adams through Minor White, etc. These folks ended up teaching in institutions. Prior to that, photography, as I had mentioned, were passed from master to apprentice, or in small classroom situations, or in scientific applications or military applications of photography. But the universities now in post-war were starting to house photography programs in their art programs. Here's a Brett Weston abstraction, the son of Edward Weston, and Aaron Siskin working with the still life and abstractions close up. Chicago, 1949. Siskind and Harry Callahan were very influential photographers, and in Callahan's case, teachers too. This is his double exposure, Chicago, 1956. Students of Minor White were Paul Caponegro, who made this galaxy apple, and Jerry Uelsman. On the West Coast, Win Bullock, old typewriter, 1951. Del Monte Forest, 1956. and Point Lobos, 1956. And Bullock extensively about photography and was another great influence on others. So these folks shared their knowledge with the younger photographers coming up. Did a lot of workshops. When Robert Frank came to the United States from Europe, he did a documentary series that ended up in a book called The Americans. And this is one from New Orleans, Chicago. And his book was had a lot of impact since an outsider was looking at life, cultural life, and scenery in the United States. Gary Winogrand, another street photographer, who in this case, this fellow went along and when he died, there were something like 3,000 to 5,000 rolls of undeveloped film in his refrigerator. A prolific photographer, often not even bringing the camera up to his eye, and had an uncanny way of doing casual photographs that were having incredible elements working against one another or with one another within the scene. Diane Arbus doing work with a medium format handheld. Diane Arbus would also affect a lot of portrait photographers in our time. We're coming to the end. This is Dwayne Michaels, another influential photographer. This is called The Illuminated Man, 1969. And Michaels would often write some text with his pieces. He loved to do sequences. Here is the human condition. His subject in a subway, seeming alienated in the busy network of transportation within the big city, gradually morphing into the Milky Way. Things Are Queer by Dwayne Michaels, 1972. He loved working with sequences, and here he has miniatures, and as you see, the sequence deals with very surrealistic interpretation, the image within the image. Jerry Ullsman, and we're going to end here. There's a lot more that deals with modern, but I see that our time is just past, and I feel I've worn you folks out. This is Jerry Ullsman's The Philosopher's Desk in 1976. As some of you may know, this combination printer, proud to refer to his roots as Robinson and Raylander in the 19th century of combining different negatives onto the same piece of paper, and really a surrealistic approach, just passed away a few days ago, and you may have seen some of the memorials on him. This is his untitled 1980, referred to as Cube Over Ocean. And I'll end with this. My images are obviously symbolic, but not symbolically obvious. Okay, let me switch back to you. I'm not sure how to unshare. Let's see, let me close that real quick. I think I'll get there. Close that. Okay. Is anybody still with us?
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm
we
still
are.
here.
Okay. I have more to show you as we come to more modern times, but I think Jonathan wanted more of our historical roots. Isn't that right?
Well, that's good. Maybe eventually we'll have to do a part 2 or something.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
I'd enjoy that. I enjoyed this very much. Thank you, Steve.
well, thank you, James.
you.
And do you have any burning questions, folks? Don't be bashful.
Uh, there was a conflict between painting and photography for a while, maybe better described as jealousy.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't.
Worked its way out.
Yeah, I didn't. I'm not the world's foremost expert. I just taught a rudimentary history class for years at City College, but from the way I interpret the history, there were folks right from 1839 who thought of it as another medium of art. Okay, but it wasn't accepted in all in most of the powerful places that marketed art in those days, the salons. Their fortune was made in painting, and their commerce was painting and sculpture, drawing, etc. And ironically, I'm going to show you a book here. Let me get it for you real quick. It's down there. I've got to grab that real quick. Excuse me. So I had the great fortune of attending and being part of the 1989 celebration of the 150th anniversary of photography, or no, yeah, 150th anniversary of photography, and my lips aren't working very well after that long talk. But I first heard at that special event, we had a keynote speaker that described how they were discovering hidden things that artists were using of camera vision way back to the Renaissance. It wasn't understood. They kept it quiet. They didn't want their secret to get out, that their wonderful renditions were in fact aided by camera vision in some of those tools that I described. If you ever get a chance, of course it looks backwards here in the picture. This is David Hockney's Secret Knowledge, and it's a whole book on this. As a matter of fact, there is a video that was produced in Great Britain, a film version of this, and he did an extensive study shortly after researchers were doing groundbreaking discoveries in this, where he proved that they were using these tools to make important paintings. So the painters wanted to keep it quiet. Okay, so, and then some of them were frustrated. They didn't want to just settle with painting. They wanted to make direct images on materials. And as soon as that happened, of course, the painting world felt that it was cheating. And in some areas of society, they thought it was sacrilegious. I mean, it was such a huge discovery to have an image depicted. Well, you may remember stories of National Geographic photographers early National Geographic photographers giving photographs to their subjects who had never been in a picture before and were shocked and amazed. And in some societies still feel that photographers, the photograph steals the soul. So there was resistance to it, also because it didn't involve the hand, the creation with the hand, carving, painting, stroking on canvas, paper, etc. So those things were at work against photographers, and many of the photographers didn't consider themselves artists either. They were just documenting things. So a lot of those folks were, I mean, most of the ones we saw in this slideshow were pretty committed to doing artistic work. But a lot of photographs were made just to make portraits and just to document a building that was going to be taken down or whatever. So there were a lot of practical reasons for using photography that had nothing to do with art for art's sake, so to speak. I don't know if that helps, but by the time education kicked in after World War II, and there were groups like F64 at work extolling the virtues of straight photography for its own right as an art form, things started to change. So by 1960, and between 1960 and 1970, museums started to take it seriously. They went into the history. They saw the value. Some photographers were discovering previously undiscovered works that had just been hidden, and all of that came to light. And then with people like Adams and a few others, that when I was coming up and a 20-year-old, those prints were selling for $10, maybe $25. The earliest ones. That's what photographs sold for. I bought an Imogen Cunningham in 1973 for $90. So and then what Adams did and the marketing of his work did for the photographic world, it raised the awareness and the level of interest and the collectability of photographs. And a lot of other folks were working at around the same time. So about by the 70s, it started exploding into to the surface. And now you can't find a museum that doesn't consider photographic or photographic influenced art as the top level.
Great.
Did that answer your question a little bit?
Thank you very much, Steve. I've enjoyed your presentation. If anybody else has anything you want to say before we sign off?
No, I'm going to sign off. Thanks again, Steve. Appreciate it very much.
Okay, James, say hello.
All right, I will do that.